Everyone for being here tonight. And I hope that you end up finding this helpful. We've got about 45 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Uh, the way that this is going to work is this webinar is about, as you can see on the screen, navigating the academic job market. And so what we're going to do is I've got some prepared remarks that I'll spend about 20, 25 minutes going through. And that should leave plenty of time for questions that people might want to ask. Regarding questions, please feel free as we go to pop questions into the chat as I'm proceeding through this. Um, that way they'll be on the screen and recorded. I am going to wait to answer those questions until I get through everything that I've prepared. But so don't think that I haven't seen them or that I'm ignoring you. I'm just going to wait to answer them till I get to the end. What I'm going to discuss tonight is a number of things. I'm going to start with talking about some of the kinds of jobs that you might see advertisements for, some resources that you can use when looking for academic jobs, some of the kinds of documents that you may be asked to produce when applying for jobs, and then just giving a little bit of insight into how the process of an institution going through the search and interviews typically works. And then we'll turn to questions. If you have questions about things that I don't go over directly, that's perfectly fine. The only thing I will say, sorry, had a little winged visitor there, is there are going to be a couple things that I probably won't be able to get into in great detail tonight, particularly when I go over some of the documents that you may need. I was making my list of the various documents that I might want to talk about, and I realized that I could do an entire sort of 30, 45 minute, even longer talk about those documents. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk very briefly in slight detail about two of them, and I'll explain why those two when we get there. And then I'm going to put together another one of these talks for maybe somewhere in late July, early August that specifically focuses on some of those other documents. Please don't let that deter you from asking questions about those documents tonight, but I may just say, oh, I'll go into that in greater detail at another event, but don't let that stop you from asking those questions, okay? And even if your questions are, like I said, about things that I don't go over here, please feel free to ask them anyway. And I know I said that we have till about 7 o'clock, but I am happy to stick around on this call until everyone gets to get their big questions that they might have answered. So I have no problem having things run over a little bit from there. So as I go through this, like I said, just feel free to post any questions that come up as we go, and I'll start with those when we get to the Q&A, and you can also ask questions when we get to the end as well. I'm kind of flying solo here in terms of moderating and presenting, so I may pause to let some folks in as we go. So if I get distracted briefly, that is why. Okay, so whoops. Well, so here we go. Let's go ahead and start. So I'm going to first talk about there are a couple of different kinds of positions that you might find out there when we're talking about academic jobs. And several of these have different kinds of names attached to them, but there's really kind of three categories. First, you've got your full-time tenure track positions, or some institutions don't call them tenure track. They don't use the term tenure, but they're any kind of job that quote unquote automatically renews, that is full-time with benefits. These are the jobs that everybody wants. They are the full-time positions. When you imagine a professor having a job, it's the kind of job that we're talking about. These positions involve teaching some number of courses. Every university and college has a different teaching load. They also often come with other job requirements, including committee work, service expectations to the university, scholarly or creative production, and that sort of thing. So when we talk about when you think of the most traditional kinds of teaching jobs, those are the ones we're talking about. Frankly, not to start us off on a dour or pessimistic note, I would say that tenure track full-time positions focused in creative writing are amongst the hardest jobs to get these days, not just at the university level, but in general. There are so many people interested in them and so few of them relative to the number of people graduating with credentials to get them. So just to be honest about what the difficulties are, I can talk about some numbers a little bit later. But anyway, so that's one kind of position. Another full-time type of position that you might find are things that are called often called visiting professorships or temporary positions. These are full-time with benefits. They are usually primarily teaching. So oftentimes at the same institution, a visiting or temporary position, or sometimes what is called a full-time lectureship, will be primarily teaching. So even at the same institution as a place with tenure track positions, these will often, though not always, have greater teaching expectations, so more classes per term than your tenure track jobs, but will often not come with many other expectations. So there's not going to be as much committee work, service expectations, scholarly production expectations. Sometimes these are renewable for a number of years. So you'll see in advertisements things like maybe renewed for up to 3 years or things like that, but they often have some kind of end date. These exist for a number of reasons. One is that someone goes on a sabbatical for a year, and so they need someone to step in and teach for the person that's not teaching anymore, at least not temporarily. Sometimes someone retires or quits unexpectedly, and there isn't time to do a more robust permanent replacement, so they'll do a temporary placement. Or frankly, institutions are getting a little cheekier with tenure track positions, and so they fill the spots they need with visiting or temporary positions. And then the other kind of position you have is a part-time or what is called an adjunct position. These are very different. They are often, instead of having benefits and salary, they are paid for by the course. So institutions have a certain amount that they pay either per credit hour or per course, and instructors that are part-time are paid by the course. These are contingent, meaning that they usually are only available when an institution needs them. So adjunct faculty, part-time faculty often don't have much job security, but there is also usually no service or scholarship work. It's simply teach 1, 2, 3 courses paid for by the course. Okay. So those are the kinds of positions, generally speaking. And you may find there are every now and then some weird other sorts of things. There are postdoctoral fellowships, there are writer in residence positions, but they often fit within one of these 3 buckets. Usually those are the 3 kinds of jobs we're talking about. Okay. All right, so then here's a couple of resources. You may want to write some of these down. At the end, I can always toss links into the chat. But when I was last on the job market, these were the 4 primary places that I went in search of positions. I will say one of these, the AWP one, does require a membership to access. The other 3 are completely free. I'm not an AWP apologist. I'm not going to tell you that it's worth it getting a membership just to have access to that resource, but it is a resource that exists. So the first one, and probably the one where you are going to find the most of these positions, is higheredjobs.com, which includes positions of all sorts, administrative, teaching, executive, includes both full-time and part-time positions. AWP Writer. The nice thing about AWP Writer, I will say, is that they generally only post writing jobs. So that includes both teaching positions and like editorships, working for publishing companies, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the one way that resource is a little different, and you might actually find it worthwhile to have a membership. The other 3, higheredjobs.com, the MLA Job List, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed Job List, are all specifically education teaching jobs. The MLA Job List, joblist.mla.org, which used to be behind a paywall but no longer is, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed Job List, which is jobs.chronicle.com, also free, generally only post full-time positions. Higher Ed Jobs will post full-time and part-time. And we can talk a little bit about the value of looking at part-time positions in a little bit, as to why that might be a strategically valuable choice to make. So those are just 4 resources that are very good for looking up jobs. I'm sure there are others, but those are the ones that you generally are going to catch sight of every job or almost every job that is available in a particular job cycle. And I'll talk about what I mean by that a little bit later as well. By virtue of looking at all of these, you're going to catch just about everything at some point or another. So let's talk a little bit. So you're looking for job positions, talking about some of the required documents. Now, this looks perhaps on first glance like a really long list of things that you need to have. And some of you, as I'm going through this list, might be like, oh, God, I don't have that, especially the ones that are related to teaching don't freak out. I'm going to explain these. I'm going to in a little bit, to a certain degree, I'm going to explain some of these. The ones I'm really going to go into particular detail here this evening are the first two, the cover letter and what's called the curriculum vitae, because in all the years that I've ever looked for jobs, I have never seen a job posting that did not require both of those documents. Everything else on this list, the writing sample, the teaching philosophy statement, sample syllabi and assignments, diversity or research or creative activity statements, course evals and letters of recommendation or reference information, I've gotten asked for from some jobs, but certainly not all. And not every job asks for all of these things at the very beginning. But the two documents that get asked for pretty much without fail are a cover letter and a CV. If you're not sure what a CV is, don't worry. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But just to say a few things really quickly. So the things I'm not going to touch on too deeply tonight are the writing sample and everything else further down on this list. But I will just say a couple of things about them really quickly. If you have never taught before, that's okay. You can still create a sample syllabus. You can still write a teaching philosophy statement, which is essentially what it says, is what your ideas about what it means to be a teacher, what good approaches to teaching are, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine those. You can create your sense of what you would do in a course. We do have, in case you don't know, if some of you I know in this event are relatively new to the program, we offer courses in teaching, the pedagogies of teaching first year composition. And we also have coursework. We're going to have coursework, you don't have it yet, on how to, on teaching creative writing. And in those courses, you get a chance to make some of those, hypothetical documents. But don't worry if you don't have some of these. If you don't have course evaluations, don't worry about that. But you can write up pretty much everything else. A writing sample, I'll say, is exactly what it sounds like, a sample of your creative work. For letters of recommendation, what a lot of places are moving toward these days is information for references rather than having to actually have those letters ready. We can talk about letters of recommendation tonight if people have some questions about those, but I'll kind of leave those to themselves. Because what will often happen is you'll get asked to submit some of these documents from the very beginning, and then certain candidates who make it to the next round, we'll talk about the process here shortly, will be asked to provide more, sometimes, not always. But let's talk about these first two documents, because like I said, pretty much without fail, including a cover letter and a curriculum vitae is going to be required in any job application for an academic job that you're applying for. So what is a cover letter? So if you've ever applied for a job, you've probably had to include some kind of application letter, but academic job cover letters are a little bit different, and they have some very specific expectations, typical expectations. And this is not to say that doing things slightly differently than this is going to necessarily hurt you. I kind of modeled this outline on the cover letters that I've written in the past. And so generally speaking, they want to be 1 to 2 pages, single-spaced, and usually on institutional letterhead. We have electronic Lindenwood letterhead that if any of you are going to start applying for academic jobs, I can get a hold of for you. But so usually these are 1 to 2 single-space pages. Just as a really small thing, you often want to start these with the greeting, "Dear members of the search committee." Some job ads will indicate who the chair of the search committee is. I'll get into the search committee here when we get to the process part. And you can address it to that person, but "Dear members of the search committee" works just fine. And then what I've got here is just your basic outline of what this document looks like. So your first paragraph will talk about your educational experience, where you got your terminal degree or your most recent highest level degree, what you studied when you got that degree. If you have any teaching experience, either as a student teacher, as a TA, or whatever teaching experience you might have, you include this there. If you don't have any, don't include something saying like, "I don't have any teaching experience," but as anyone that's been a job seeker knows, you don't draw attention to your quote unquote deficiencies. You just don't mention those absences, and that's okay. Then your second paragraph definitely is where you would talk about your creative work, what you do as a writer, any publishing that you've done, your accomplishments as a writer, and then situating yourself within the writing world. Who are you? Who are you in conversation with? What are you trying to accomplish with your writing? And then the last few paragraphs, it doesn't have to be 3 paragraphs, 3, 4, 5. If you have only a third paragraph and then a final paragraph, that's fine. But this is where you talk about some of the things that you'd be interested in doing with their institution, where the kinds of service work you're interested in, whether that is setting up events for students, running literary magazines. These don't have to be things that you have done. If you've done any of them, that's great, but things that you are interested in. You can briefly mention the things that you think about teaching, how you would or do go about teaching courses, what kinds of courses you're excited to teach, the kinds of things you see being important in current teaching, whatever those things might be. And those paragraphs can have quite a lot of variety in terms of what goes and what doesn't go in them. And then you do include a final paragraph where you kind of wrap up who you are, and you reference and make reference to any materials that you've included in your application, which should basically just be a list of the things that they've asked for. So that's what a cover letter typically looks like. So then your CV. So a CV is essentially an academic version of a resume. Instead of really necessarily being oriented around skills and all of your job experience across industries, you are largely focusing on what your education looks like, what your scholarly and creative work is, and any teaching that you've done. And again, the areas that you don't have things in, you just leave those out. So you typically will begin with the degrees that you possess. So my CV has my contact information at the top, then it's got a list of my BA, my MA, and my PhD. And then after that, you include a description of your terminal project. So if you have a master or an MFA, you describe your thesis project. If you have a PhD, you describe your dissertation. You don't do both. So I have a PhD and an MA. I don't include my master's thesis description anywhere because I just include the highest terminal project that I've done. Then in whatever order makes sense to you, whatever is strongest, you would include listings of your teaching experience, any publications, any awards you've gotten, any service, anything that feels relevant to applying for an academic job. Okay, so I don't want to be mean to, I'm not trying to be talked down to this, but this is not where you would include your 4 years of working as a bartender. There's nothing wrong with having spent 4 years working as a bartender. I worked in restaurants for a very long time. But that doesn't go in my CV because it's not really academic experience. And you can order things based on what makes sense to you or what you think looks most impressive. I put my publications first because I've got several books, several short story and essay publications. So those are at the beginning after that terminal project. And then the last thing that you usually include is information for any references or people who would write you or supply you with letters of recommendation. There is no real one way to make a curriculum vitae look. When I've served on search committees, the number of different formats for curriculum vitas that I've seen is essentially equal to the number of applications that we've gotten. If you just do a quick Google for how should my CV look, you'll get tons of resources that are all going to tell you something slightly different because there is no, you must do it this way or this other way. But highlighting your degrees followed by your projects, followed by those other things is probably the best way to go. But again, I don't think if you have them organized in a slightly different way that you're ever going to find yourself in a situation where something bad happens. So that's a bit about those documents. Again, if you want to ask questions about any of the other documents that I've listed here, please feel free. But like I said, my plan is to set up another event sometime in the future to go over some of the details of some of those, and even to share with you some samples, so that you can actually take a look at what some documents might look like. Okay. All right. So now that we talked about those, let's talk a little bit about the process. So first things first, I'm going to go through this list of things here. But the first thing I'll say is who is doing these searches? Okay. So when an institution is looking to do a new hire, and I'm talking primarily about full-time hires here. Part-time hiring can be a little funky. Every school does that radically different if you're applying for adjunct jobs. And I'll talk about that here in just a second once I go through this sequence. This is really primarily for full-time positions. So every school is going to have a slightly different makeup for a full-time search. If you make it to a certain stage, usually stage 2 here, you'll find out who some of these people are. But generally speaking, there is a search committee chair. At many institutions, though not all, that chair is also the department chair. It just depends on the size of the institution and the size of the department. Sometimes the department chair is not on the committee, but more often than not, I would say they are the chair of the search. Usually there is then 2 or 3, maybe 4 other members of the department of faculty that is on that committee. And most most institutions ask for committees to include at least one what they call outside person. This doesn't mean some random person off the street. This means a faculty member in a different area. So somebody from biology or sociology or math or history will also serve on these committees. There may also be some other random folks included in these. I've seen student members of search committees. I've seen someone from HR. I've seen deans on committees. It just really depends on the institution, but you're usually talking between 3 to 6 people that are on these committees that are reading these materials. This still means that you can write your materials to people who are in the know. So that's one thing I will also mention is that you can generally assume that the vast majority of the people making these decisions are within the area. They are creative writers. They are English faculty. They will understand terminology and writerly lingo that you might utilize in your materials. And you don't need to define and clarify those terms for people. Okay. So how does this process usually go? Well, you can see this list here, so let me go through this quickly, but explain a couple things. So the thing with as I said at the beginning, sometimes searches for creative writing faculty are the most difficult jobs to get, and that's because the applicant pools for these can be humongous. At my last job, so for those of you that don't know, I came to Lindenwood from St. Charles Community College, which is a 2-year college in the same area as Lindenwood. I was the department chair there for a couple of years, and I chaired a search for 2 new full-time faculty. And this was at a 2-year community college. And for those 2 positions, we had 145 applicants. That is probably less than many creative writing jobs are getting. And I don't say that to discourage anyone or to make anybody feel sort of bad about themselves or the unlikelihood of getting a position, but I do want to be realistic. I want to be honest about what you're seeing. So the applicant pool is sometimes going to be hundreds of people. I have heard, but can't confirm that this is true, that some searches will have, 500, 600, 700 applicants. I don't know if that's true. I have never, been on the search side of a pool that big, but you certainly can be looking at hundreds of applicants, which is part of the reason why, as I said, some searches will start with only asking for a few documents. So one thing I didn't include in here is one step of this process can be that they will start with just a curriculum vitae and a cover letter, maybe also a writing sample, do a first round cut from there to get it down to a more manageable number, then ask for more documents before they move to the next stage. Everybody does this a little differently. So this is just my best sort of to the median or to the mean version of what this looks like. So what'll generally happen, so the biggest and most difficult cut, frankly, to get through is cutting down the applicant pool to 8 to 12 candidates. Again, these are averaging numbers, who will be invited to do an initial interview. So if you made it that far, you have almost certainly made it past more people than you're going to make it past, if that makes sense. This is the biggest cut down by a wide margin to get to this first stage interview. So you've accomplished a pretty big thing if you do that. Just in the interest of share, I don't feel like there's anything wrong with sharing this. I started looking for new jobs prior to getting this job at Lindenwood that I'm now in a couple of years ago. And I applied that year for 36 jobs, and I managed to get 9 initial interviews. And that was exactly 25% of the jobs I applied for. And I'm not saying this to like sound big-headed or to pat myself on the back. If you get 25%, if you have a 1 out of every 4 success rate of getting interviews, that is astronomical. And I'm not saying that to be like, wow, look how awesome I am. I got very lucky, I think. It was very unexpected that happened. I was also being relatively discerning. I can also talk a little bit about how you decide what to apply for. There were jobs I didn't apply for that year. I could have applied for hundreds, but I didn't. But to get 25% from step 1 to step 2 that would be, I would take that any year that I was ever applying for jobs. That would be humongous. So the first thing after reading those materials, possibly the step I haven't included here is being asked for more material, is to do an initial interview. So these will usually either take place on Zoom, Microsoft Teams. Sometimes they're just a phone interview. Those are kind of weird because you can't see anything. And these are usually going to be 30 to 45 minutes. Sometimes they give you an hour. I've done ones that were 20 minutes, so they can be very short or a little longer, where you'll be asked questions about a number of things. There's all sorts of things that I've been asked all sorts of weird questions. But generally speaking, there are going to be questions asking you to kind of describe what creative projects you're working on, what areas of interest you have in teaching, how you would handle certain issues as it relates to teaching, as it relates to being at a college campus more broadly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole wide range of things. You might get asked about your influences. You might get asked, I've gotten asked more than once about dream classes. You know, if I could create a course that I could teach of any sort that I ever wanted to, what would it be and why? Um, you know, how do you what's a teaching moment where things didn't go the way you'd planned, and what did you learn from it? Stuff like that. So all sorts of various things. Those will happen, and then what usually will happen is that interview group of 8 to 12 will get cut down to a group of between 3 and 5 finalists. Three is usually the most popular number. And what will happen is one at a time, each of those finalists will be brought to campus. The school will pay to fly you out or for you to drive or whatever. You know, they'll put you up in a hotel, take you out to meals. And it's a couple of days. Usually it's a day of travel, the actual day of your what's called a campus visit, and then the next day to travel home. And so your day on campus can, again, just like all these, this is the most frequent things that you might be asked to do. But there's some variation. You will almost always do some kind of teaching demonstration. Some schools will give you complete freedom to decide what that teaching demonstration is about or what kind of course it would be for. Sometimes it's more particularized. We want you to give a talk as if you were teaching midway through an intro to creative writing course. We want you to do a fake workshop or something like that. They'll give you instructions for what that teaching demonstration will be, but I think I've done one campus visit in my life that did not include a teaching demonstration, and that was it. You'll also maybe be asked to give a job talk. Now, that can be a whole lot of different things. Most frequently in creative writing, it will involve reading an excerpt of your work and talking in greater detail than you did in your cover letter about who you are as a writer. And then people that show up can ask you questions. You will likely have some meetings with various campus leaders. This can be, depending on the size of the school, almost certainly the department chair if they are not part of the search, the dean who is most close on the organizational ladder to the department chair. Sometimes someone further up. I've talked to, I haven't really talked, if you're applying for a job at a big R1 university, you are almost certainly not going to talk to the university president. You might talk to the provost. If you're applying for a job at a really tiny institution, you might talk to the president. It just depends. And then almost always another interview with that same search committee where they have another set of questions to ask you. You'll usually have some informal stuff where you're still kind of on to give the show. You have a lunch with the search committee. You might meet with students to talk to them, take their questions. I've had that has been in various different forms, but all sorts of different things that might happen on those days. And then typically the job is offered to a candidate, and there are any number of ways that different institutions decide who they're going to offer the job to. But what usually happens is they have a first choice. They offer that person the job. If they say no, they go to their second choice. If they say no, they go to their third choice. That can vary depending on the school and how they feel about the choices. It sometimes happens where they don't end up liking the third choice. They might invite another person to campus, et cetera, et cetera. But that's essentially the flow of this. Now, in terms of timing, I mentioned the academic kind of job market calendar, the cycle earlier. We're almost at the start of the new cycle. So oftentimes in early July, early August, you will start seeing job postings that will start in the next academic year. So in the next couple of weeks on those various resources we talked about, positions will start getting posted that have start dates in fall of 2026. So your typical kind of cycle, and then jobs will appear throughout the year. April, May, June, they start to really fall off because that's that weird time right before a new school year starting. Obviously, it would be hard to do all of this in a 2-month period. You see them every now and then, but not really. So the boon is really July through November. That's where the most of the jobs appear. Some appear in the spring, but not as many. And your typical timeline is usually most frequent. Again, we're going averages here. Is these first round interviews often take place late in the fall semester, and then those finalist visits usually take place early in the spring. Every now and then, a committee will be trying to work really fast and get those finalists to campus in the fall in order to have everything sorted out quickly. but this can be a very protracted and slow process. It's gotten faster over time. We don't need to get into history, but 10, 15 years ago, it could take, you could do an initial interview, you could submit an application in September, do an initial interview in December, do a campus visit in March, and get or not get the job in April. So it could be a really, really long, drawn out process, but it's gotten much quicker. Though it can still feel very slow. If you apply for a position and don't hear anything for a week, that's normal. The other thing I should add, speaking of not hearing anything, is the frustrating thing can be, well, some jobs will let you know relatively quickly if you don't make it past that first cut. A lot of them won't. A lot of jobs will wait until they've actually offered the job to a candidate to inform anyone that they didn't get to this first stage. What will often happen is if you get to this stage, you won't find out that you didn't get a finalist spot until they have someone under contract, because what they don't want to have happen is to tell you that you didn't make it, not like any of their finalists, or have none of their finalists accept the job, and then have to go back to the people they quote unquote rejected after this stage and say, just kidding, do you want to come for a visit? So you might do a Teams interview in November and not hear that you didn't get the job until April. You also might just get through any phase and then never hear anything. I won't name names, but there were 2 instances in the last 3 years where I was a finalist for a position and then simply never heard from the university again. So it's ugly, but it does happen. But you will often, and then there are jobs that you'll apply for and you simply will never hear anything. Just because of the number of applications they get. I don't think that's great. I think it's a bad way to do things, but it does happen. So silence is not unusual when it comes to these kinds of things. So just one thing that you just need to know is that you got to be ready for various institutions to just not get back to you. Just like getting rejected from literary magazines and presses and agents is like par for the course in creative writing, so is getting rejected from jobs pretty par for the course. Okay, so that's what I have prepared. I'm going to stop sharing. Hopefully everyone can see me. And so let's see. Okay, there's a couple of questions. So I'll start with these, and then if other folks have questions, I will be happy to teach them, or take them. So first, is it more difficult for online MFA students to get letters of recommendation? I don't think it's, I think that depends on your experience with instructors. I have written letters of recommendations already for students in this program. I think this is probably not directly related to your question, but if you take more than one course with someone, definitely asking those folks is a great idea. In terms of number of letters of recommendation, 3 is the typical amount that you'll probably have to indicate 3 potential references, get 3 letters of recommendation. Especially whoever you take your thesis course with in this program should almost certainly be happy to serve as a reference. But anybody that you've taken classes with, especially when you've taken more than one class with, just reach out to them by email. We all know that this is part and parcel of the cycle of the world that we live in. So we all expect and anticipate offering up letters of recommendation, or at the very least serving as references as well. And if anybody has follow-up questions to the answers, just pop them in the chat, or we'll can get to asking more once I go through the ones that are written. Typically, no, Lauren, you don't usually need additional teaching licenses to teach at the college level. I have weirdly seen periodic job ads, mostly at the 2-year college level, which should also feel like a very viable kind of place to get a job. If people want to hear more about that, I can speak to teaching at community college. I taught there at one for 10 years. Some states require that after you get hired, you get a license, but you don't typically have to have that before you can apply. And it's almost never at the 4-year college level. So usually that's not something you need to worry about. If a school does have a state that's got some weird requirement, usually they'll be okay with, once they've offered you the job, you can go through whatever licensure requirement there might be. How long is a teaching demonstration usually? That's a good question, Loria. Those can very much vary. They will usually tell you how long. I would say the typical range is usually 30 minutes to an hour, but they'll definitely tell you how long you're going to have to do whatever kind of demonstration they want you to do. But I've seen them in different orders. Let's see. Maddie, yes, that can be on there. So if you've worked at a institution of higher ed, even if it's not in a teaching position, I think including that is totally fine. That would make sense to include that versus even if it's in like the advancement office but especially if it's in something adjacent. So if you've been like a writing tutor or you've worked in a department office, great. But you can include anything that's involved in working at a university. I think that makes sense. Sorry, I'm going quickly because I don't want to run out of time, but the system's not going to boot us off. Let's see. Paul, great question. I would say these days there are a lot more part-time positions than full-time positions. And it is probably going to be easier to find adjunct positions. Just to piggyback that into Lauren's question, the adjunct hiring process is a bit hard to talk about with certainty just because every school does it so radically differently. You almost certainly are not going to go through those kinds of steps that I outlined in the presentation. When I taught at the community college, if someone had a master's degree and was available, I was usually ready to hire them because we were often so desperate, to be honest. But usually what will happen more typically is, you might get asked to do either a phone conversation with the department chair. And that's usually it. There's not usually a committee that is reviewing applications for adjunct instruction. And this is going to sound bad, but I'm just going to be honest. Oftentimes, two-year colleges especially, this may not be as much the case at four-year universities, they're desperate when they're hiring, and they also know that they're not quote unquote stuck with someone. Just to be frank, it is sometimes harder to get rid of a full-time person than it is a part-time person. A part-time person can just not be offered classes, so there's not necessarily as much vetting on the front end, if that makes sense. But in terms of otherwise hiring, that process is usually for adjunct positions, you often only need to submit a CV and a cover letter, and then they'll get in touch with you. Another thing that's worth mentioning about part-time is that what you may encounter with job ads is mentioning of an adjunct pool. So sometimes departments and institutions will look to get a bunch of potential instructors, even if they don't actively need people for that term. And they want to have people, quote unquote, on standby so that if they need to hire people, they can. So you might not get called for, if you put in an application for a part-time position tomorrow, you might not get called to teach that fall, but you might find yourself suddenly getting called to teach in the spring. So if anybody asking about part-time positions has more questions about that, I can talk to them more. Oh, so good question about the letters of rec. Usually what you would do seeking a letter of recommendation is ask for a letter that is essentially generically about you. So it's generic in that it would be usable for every job that you'd apply for, but it would obviously be specifically about you. So it will be about you, Carolyn. So they should be, and if they've forgotten anything, they would do their homework, or some faculty will ask for some reminders, but they won't just, they'll write something specific to you, but it will be a letter you can use for all the jobs that you would ask for. So great question about course evals. So there's a couple of different ways. That's going to depend a little bit on, and just by the way, as 7 o'clock runs up, if folks hear what they want to hear and want to duck out, my feelings will not be hurt, but I will happily stick around to answer as many questions as are here. So if you want, one way that places like to get course evals is if you have a way of downloading PDFs of whatever it is that your institution gives you. That's what I usually do is I download, whatever reports it is that get run, and I make a PDF or a screenshot works. If you can pull direct quotes, that's great, but you don't want to just put in like create a Word document of those quotes because there's no way to verify those. But whatever file type it is that you've been given, or however your course evals are delivered, usually you can save those in such a way that they can take them. So whatever way it is that you can get access to those evals to save. Lauren, right now we don't, but we are working on something that I don't want to say too much about because it's kind of still very much in the baby stages of working. But in terms of the question of getting teaching experience, I know that that has been asked to me before. Probably the best route is to try to start in those part-time positions, because oftentimes a lot of schools are willing to take on adjunct faculty who are just getting started. There will be some kind of like uh, pseudo mentorship and onboarding and stuff like that to make sure you're supported. Hopefully, if the department that you're in knows what they're doing, they will have that available to you. But that's a great way to get that teaching experience, because oftentimes to get those adjunct positions, there's not necessarily an expectation that you have taught before. I know at Lindenwood, the English department hires adjunct faculty that are just coming out of a grad program, and they don't necessarily have to have taught before. Let's see. Is it Oh, okay. Yes. So to the question of, is it possible to work as an assistant professor of English with an MFA? Yes. So the MFA is considered a terminal degree, and anything that is writing, even if it doesn't say ENG in its sort of like course, what's the word, like course code, that is considered English graduate work. Yeah. Several of the Shayna Youngdahl in our program has an MFA, and she's full time. There was a time about 15 years ago where the answer to that question often would have been no. Lots of schools did not recognize the MFA as a terminal degree, but if you are going after a creative writing oriented full-time teaching position, most schools, I don't want to say every single place, but almost everyone recognizes that is a terminal degree and is considered the degree that you need. Great. Yes, I do. I just need to remind myself for the letterhead question. I do have that. I just need to remind myself where it is and where to get it, because I've been using it for other formal documents that I've had. But I will get a hold of that and can get that sent out to anybody who wants it once I find it. Let's see. Did I miss anyone's questions? Do folks have other questions? One thing that I didn't mention that I do want to mention, because someone had been emailing me and we talked about this, and I don't know if that person is here. I've gotten questions about like, okay, but there's all these positions that want you to have a certain amount of teaching already, but I don't have that. How do you have to have experience to get the experience, right? So a couple of things. One, if you don't ever have any teaching experience, one thing is to look for those part-time teaching opportunities, especially at two-year colleges. Depending on where you are located, obviously, is going to affect how many different kinds of teaching opportunities at two-year colleges there are in your area, because that's going to be dependent on how many two-year colleges are around your area. But they're almost always looking for folks, especially in fall terms. So if you go to, say, higheredjobs.com and you put in your geographic area, I'd be really surprised if you didn't find somewhere nearby that is seeking part-time instructors. So that's one way that you can deal with that. The other thing is sometimes job ads will say something is a minimum required qualification, and required is kind of more like ideal. So I have certainly applied for jobs that I didn't meet the minimum requirements for, like very clearly, and have still gotten interviewed for. There was at least one where I was a finalist for the job, even though I very blatantly didn't meet a minimum qualification. So frankly, apply for those jobs anyway. You never know what's going to happen. As long as you can handle and are okay with the possibility of not getting the job, which, as creative writers, we all have to get used to being told no sometime. There's no harm. Worst comes to worst, you just won't make it out of that initial big pile of people. But if you really want to make sure that you have that teaching experience, looking for those part-time teaching opportunities at both 2 and 4-year level. I'm not telling you not to go for the 2-year or not to go for the 4-year, but the 2-year colleges are very welcoming of folks who are just getting started. Is network helping in the teaching space? It can be. I don't know how often folks get into tenure track jobs because they know someone. That can be the case, but I don't know that networking has not gotten me any of the jobs I've gotten. So I can't really say yes or no to. I mean, there's no harm, obviously, in getting to know people and talking to people, but I don't think it's necessarily going to get you a leg up. Because here's the thing, you could get to know someone at an institution really, really well, and then they're not on the search committee. And search committees can't really talk to anyone outside their search committees about potential candidates. And people outside the search committees can't really talk to the search committees either. There's this like rules about that. So it can become a crapshoot in that regard. Let's see. Is there a risk we doesn't have to pay you full salary? I think it's well, okay. So there's kind of two questions there about the getting your foot in the door. So you, it's a good opportunity, but it's not necessarily gonna lead from I'm teaching as an adjunct at this institution to when they have a tenure track job come up, I'm gonna get it. Because odds are there are a number of adjuncts in the same position. Um, but you may or may not end up getting that job. So when I got my first job at the community college, I was an outside candidate. So I had adjuncted there one semester years before. But the year I was hired, there were two of us hired. One person had absolutely no affiliation with the college at all, and I had adjuncted there for one semester 5 years prior. We got hired when there were several adjunct faculty who applied for the jobs but didn't. The very next year, there was another hire, and it was somebody who had been adjuncting at the college who got the tenure track full-time position. So I don't think there's any harm in taking an adjunct gig at a school that you would love to teach at if a full-time position opened up. Um, Search committees, certainly, at least that I've ever encountered, are looking at you, how good of a candidate is this, and are not thinking about, well, we could avoid giving this person benefits if we made them stay as an adjunct. It's all about like, are you the best candidate for the job? Um, yes, TA. Oh, okay. So yes, TA position. Yes. So this is a great question, Jared. I think you might have been the one that emailed me about this. If you are a teaching assistant somewhere, and I know that we don't have traditional teaching assistantships here, and you teach a class, even if you are not quote unquote the instructor of record, this has become this weird thing for whatever recently. Everyone's all about the instructor of record. If you say are a teaching assistant, so let's say you go on to, let's say you finish this degree and you decide to do a PhD. Not that that's absolutely necessary, but if you do that, and let's say you get a teaching assistantship and you teach like classes while you're a TA, that counts. Like search committees, if they say we want 2 years of teaching experience, they're going to count that teaching experience. Like being at least within English, being a TA that is teaching classes, even if there's like someone supervising your teaching of that class, 100% counts as teaching experience. I have never encountered like a job ad that says time spent as a TA where you're doing the teaching doesn't count. So yeah, if you're in a program that has teaching assistantships, take them, do them, because in more traditionally oriented programs, and ours is very non-traditional in a lot of good ways, sometimes not helpfully, but in a lot of good ways, you know, the typical like trajectory is go to graduate school, and if you're in a more traditional like terminal degree program, in our areas that's the MFA or the PhD. If you have an assistantship in your teaching, that is the preparatory teaching assistant teaching experience to get you the full-time job, right? So like that is totally normal. And I have never heard of someone, at least within the humanities and English and writing and literature, like saying that the classes you teach as a TA don't count toward experience. Never encountered that. So yeah, it's a great way to get that experience. Any other questions? People can ask them out loud or post them in the chat. Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. I apologize for taking, I think it's like 3 extra minutes. This recording will go live tomorrow, hopefully, if I can conquer the technology to do so. And do be on the lookout. I'm going to try to get my act together to offer another one of these in a month or so, maybe early August. That will go into a little more detail about some of the kind of documents that I mentioned. Where I'll have some examples that I can walk us through, and folks can ask about those kinds of things as well. All right. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I can put both the slideshow and the letterhead. What I'll try to do is also you know what I think I might do is I'll create another module in the MFA Students Canvas course right under the first one that is like stuff about academic job searches, where I'll put the letterhead, I'll put the slides for this, and as I have some sample documents, I'll put those in there too, if that sounds good. So you'll be able to find all of that there, hopefully by tomorrow. Okay. All right, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. And like I said, I will put another one of these together in a couple of weeks. And if in the interim, if you're applying for any, if you see a golden opportunity appear on one of those resources and you've got any questions about it, just shoot me an email or send me a message through Canvas. If you've got any curiosities about that, I'd be happy to help you out with that. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good evening.